Nothing gets my video game appropriate adrenaline pumping quite like a hack and slash action game, and many would argue that the granddaddy of the genre is none other than Devil May Cry. What was originally a highly divergent Resident Evil game slowly spiraled within development into its own thing, and spurned a renaissance of crowd-mowing action character games. Devil May Cry would eventually have a sister when the game's creator, Hideki Kamiya, took a new idea for an action game to Sega, in the form of Bayonetta, which would be fully produced by Platinum Games, and Platinum would also fulfill, for Konami, Metal Gear Rising. The DNA shared by these three can be felt, and they're perhaps the hydra that defines the genre. There are certainly other relevant mascots with similar elements, but the direct A to B to C is what drew me to compare these three in particular. Because Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, and Metal Gear Rising may all share conventions, but there's a great deal that divides them too, which I feel is spoken to most by narrative elements involved with each character that translates to the gameplay and structure of each game. A sort of mentality I've come to think of as most centered around Dante's emphasis around skill, Bayonetta's on thrill, and Raiden's on will. What we have here are three distinct warrior stories. Dante is a half-human, half-demon hunter who is pursued by the same demon warlord who killed his father. To survive and save everyone around him, Dante has to outdo his father by destroying his nemesis, succeeding where he failed. Bayonetta is a half-witch, half-sage with amnesia who isn't aware she's a prophesized key to an intense cataclysm and has to fight to keep that fate from occurring as well as carry on her carefree lifestyle. Raiden is a half-man, half-machine who finds himself involved in the beginnings of a massive world war, wherein children's brains are hot commodities and the presidential office is in the sights of someone just a bit more unhinged than usual. These are all three heroes on their own path to take out evil, but there's a lot to consider in way of what drives each of these characters to face their respective enemies, besides the notion that it's simply to do what's right. Dante's endeavor to destroy Mundus isn't just one for revenge in the name of his father, but to have the skill to survive what Sparta did not. Devil May Cry as a whole has an immense growth mindset, with emphasis on improvement and building your skill set to match the game's high expectations. This is because you have other closely related characters as something as a measuring stick. The food chain between Mundus, Sparta, and later Virgil is made abundantly clear by the narrative of the games. All that remains is for Dante to establish his place in the hands of the player. This is best illustrated by Devil May Cry 1 and 3's repeated boss battles with Virgil, known as Nello Angelo in the former, which act as the narrative stopping points to test the wide range of Dante's acquired skills and tactics. Defeating Virgil, your closest rival, is the rite of passage for each chunk of the game. And narratively, this weaves into Dante's desire to prove himself worthy of the amulet his mother bestowed upon him, which Virgil desires, and in Devil May Cry 1, worthy to defeat Mundus in the matter Sparta and Virgil did not. Bayonetta and Raiden both have similarly recurring rivals in John and Jetstream Sam, but these encounters aren't without their overlap with Dante's. However, the meaning behind these characters I feel tend to hover elsewhere. Note how Devil May Cry games tend to introduce Dante similarly to Bayonetta. Both are shown to be flippant and capable of insane feats to deal with what's around them, but while Dante's work is almost exhausting to him, like he does this every day and it's gotten easy if not tedious for him, Bayonetta makes her work the time of her life. Compare this down the line even further to Raiden, who suited up for duty at first sight and treats the matter with very little levity. These initial peaks at each character set up their internal state of mind and motivation. After all, Bayonetta is saving the universe on a cosmic scale, but one can somewhat easily infer that her bigger motivation is getting it all done with, so she can be left alone to go back to her shopping, dancing, and simpler things. Note the flair with which she goes about her career, the various outfits she takes on to illustrate her commitment and glee, even in something as grim as a hit victim's last rites. This is because the crux of Bayonetta's character is counterculture. She's surrounded by factors and enemies who want her to be one thing or another, and often out of desire for dogmatic tradition and prophecy, but what Bayonetta fights for is her freedom from these chains, which is why her promiscuity and overall playfulness is such an important nuance of her personality. Compare that to Raiden, who doesn't take any joy in his missions because it's all grave business. Raiden has the job of putting a stop to terrorist activity and saving children from becoming cyborg cannon fodder in a world war. Of the three, Raiden is pale, grim, and the most afflicted by his own actions, showing signs of PTSD and physical ailments related to overexertion. This ties back to Raiden's main element being his willpower, the courage and conviction he feels to continue his vocation no matter how grisly or even morally gray it grows. And before you even tap a button as any of these characters, you have a clear image of where they're at. Dante has grown tired of his everyday excursions and is ready to tackle his plateau of skill. Bayonetta wants to have the freedom to be herself and enjoy every moment of it, living a life of levity and thrill, and Raiden has to maim and destroy in the name of a government he can only put so much trust in, but also stoke those fears to protect the weak who need him, relying on his will. With all this in mind, it seems a bit like the balance of the three sees Dante and Bayonetta skewed toward one another. Both are flippant and playful in their combat and demeanor, but you'll actually find most similarities end there. The most illustrative difference between the two that draws the line between the mentalities of their respective games and characters is their matter of collecting weapons. Dante gains a new weapon with every boss battle he claims, reducing his rival's essence to a new instrument of combat. In this way, gaining new weapons for Dante is something of a rite of passage. The more progress you make and skill you prove, the wider array of weaponry you have access to. Because Dante can switch between weapons and styles during battle, the game gives you more options than an upward arc with the skill you display. When you beat harder bosses along the way, you've earned the right to hazard fighting with 4 options for weapons instead of 3, and so on. This is pretty brilliantly capitalized in Devil May Cry 3 by the narrative's use of Virgil, who finishes off the beastly Beowulf after Dante's boss battle with him and claims the weapon Dante would have. Where the game consistently rewards you for your progression by bestowing new weapons, Virgil intercepting one in this case is a very straightforward meta message that he thinks you are not in a disposition of worth to wield it. Only by beating Virgil and reappropriating the gauntlets can you use them. It's in this way that Devil May Cry is a narrative of Dante proving himself progressively stronger. Bayonetta's level structure, on the other hand, hides weapons throughout stages and treats them like rewards for straying off the beaten path and exploring, precisely the opposite of Dante. A less observant player could go through a playthrough of Bayonetta and pick up no new weapons. For that matter, Bayonetta can't manually change her weapons the way Dante can in the middle of battle. Rather, you are given the choice of 2 to equip to Bayonetta's arms and legs before a mission. Bayonetta isn't about shifting between abilities during the heat of battle, but committing to one combination of weapons. The player isn't asked to keep track of much at once this way, but is encouraged to mix up their choices when equipping Bayonetta, whether it's blades on her feet or flying toxic arrows. Bayonetta also sometimes purloins the weapons of fallen foes and uses them herself, but often does so mockingly. All of this builds towards Bayonetta's desire to stand as an individual, making an utter joke of her dogmatic and stern opposition, and rarely using the same weapon the same way twice. Raiden is the odd man out here with the fewest weapon options to his name, and widely agreed by players, the least that are really that practical to use. Outside of some select situations, you'll be relying mostly on his trademark sword. This, along with other factors, make Raiden feel more accessible for newcomers, and in a narrative sense, his challenges seem easier. Raiden's ninja run performs functions like deflecting bullets and dodging obstacles automatically, contrary to the reading of foes and concentration asked of Bayonetta. And while Dante is faced with demons increasing in size and scale, Raiden often seems to be facing foes he's out of the league of. Even some earlier bosses feel a bit like they're trying to punch above their weight when fighting Raiden. This is because much of Raiden's challenge isn't if he'll win or not, but if winning is the right thing to do and if he'll do it in time. The most stress I'd feel during Rising isn't when faced with increasingly massive Metal Gear or daunting boss fight, but when hostages were screaming off-screen for Raiden to come to their aid, or when POWs are at stake very visually in the atmosphere the game occurred in. Raiden's opposition falls to pieces around him, but what really hinders him is the realization that he may not be in the right taking so many lives. It's not a question of if he's strong enough or pick the right weapons, but if he'll be able to push through his own hesitations and limits, perform his duty. The game will even take great lengths to wear down the armor of courage, worn by Raiden, and by extension, the player. The boss battles will deliver some somber last words, and there's an entire sequence devoted to triggering Raiden's PTSD with the words of those he's slain. And yet the game simultaneously encourages you to keep cutting through foes, and viscerally, not just in the sense of progressing through the game, but because Raiden's primary means of recovering health is by claiming the fuel cells from the bodies of his victims, as if to literally illustrate that no matter how difficult battle is, fighting for good bears its fruit. Bayonetta sits on the opposite end of the spectrum, as slaying foes, in her case, is its own reward, especially given her sadistic torture attacks that clearly play on BDSM staples. Bayonetta's prey has no face and are given names such as fairness and courage, widely touted virtues that Bayonetta, being a symbol of individualism and straying from the accepted norm, lives to tear apart, and in the most enjoyable and humiliating ways possible. She'll even feed some ill-fated foes to the demons she has at her beck and call, indulging yet another sensory pleasure and further indignifying the opposition in question. Although their enemies and how they relate to them in combat couldn't be more different, there's a huge similarity in how Raiden and Bayonetta dispatch their respective foes. Compare Blade Mode to the Torture Attack, which target a single opponent and transition the involved from a fight to a near minigame where minimal action is needed to fully initiate what's more or less an instant kill move. Dante has nothing of this sort. The closest thing Dante has by comparison is his Devil Trigger form, but even that is something of a stretch to consider and is, for the record, parallelly present in Bayonetta's Umbran Climax and Raiden's Jack the Ripper mode. Devil Trigger doesn't promise the destruction of an enemy in the sense that Raiden and Bayonetta's all-purpose kill switches usually do. As a matter of fact, while Dante's Devil Trigger does give him a huge push-up in power, it changes some of his functions and combos, and in that net sense is yet another tool the player must keep track of to properly utilize. Devil Trigger isn't just a press-to-win function, but another avenue that can be practiced and studied to make Dante the strongest he can be, which he has to be to overcome his towering rivals. Dante's story is one of trying harder and harder to close the crevasse in skill between himself and his peers. Bayonetta's story is one of a placeless outcast wanting to stay that way and have a good time doing so. Raiden's story is one of a torn down and cynical soldier having to find a reason to cut through foes that eerily remind him of himself. And I wanted to illustrate how these three characters, from heavily overlapping genres and extremely apparent parallel creative DNA, can still differ so heavily if you dissect the small decisions that impact gameplay through narrative. Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, and Metal Gear Rising are staples of the hack-and-slash character action genre, perhaps stereotyped for their style over substance and over-the-top violence, but I hope I made some headway into illustrating just how much thought goes into narrative choices and how they impact games, the unsung art of design, and how these three characters can leave such a distinct impression.